There is a moment in the Battle of Gettysburg that every serious student of the Civil War eventually has to sit with. Not the first day, not the second day, the third day, July 3rd, 1863. The moment when Robert E. Lee, the greatest military mind America had ever produced, looked at an open field a mile wide, with no cover and Union artillery on the high ground on the other side, and ordered 12,000 men to walk across it. Not run, walk. In formation. In the open. Toward the guns. What happened next lasted less than an hour. In less than an hour, more than 6,000 of those 12,000 men were killed or wounded. More than half. In less than an hour. And the ones who made it to the Union line, the ones who actually reached the stone wall at the top of Cemetery Ridge, were so few and so shattered that the Union soldiers who fought them hand to hand at the wall later said it felt less like repelling an attack and more like watching something die.
The attack that history calls Pickett's charge was over before most of the men who launched it had time to understand what was happening to them. And when it was over, Robert E. Lee rode out to meet the survivors, coming back across that field, and said the words that have echoed across 160 years of American history. He said, "It is all my fault." He was right. And what makes Gettysburg truly devastating, what makes it the kind of historical tragedy that you cannot look away from once you understand it fully, is not just that Lee ordered the charge, it is that he ordered it on the third day of a battle he never should have fought at all. That the charge was not a mistake made in isolation. It was the final cataclysmic consequence of a decision made weeks earlier, hundreds of miles away, in the comfortable headquarters of a general who was winning and could not stop himself from reaching for more. To understand what happened at Gettysburg, you have to understand what was happening to Robert E. Lee in the summer of 1863. He had just won his greatest victory, Chancellorsville, May 1863.
Against an army twice the size of his own, Lee had divided his forces in the face of the enemy, sent Stonewall Jackson on a flanking march through the wilderness, hit the Union right flank at dusk, and rolled it up completely, and won a victory so brilliant that military historians in Europe were writing about it in their textbooks before the year was out. Joseph Hooker, the Union commander, had come into the campaign boasting that he had the finest army on the planet and that God himself could not prevent him from destroying Lee. He left it a broken man who would never command another army in the field. Lee had done it again, had done what he always did, had found the angle, found the fear, found the moment when a bold stroke would become a decisive one, and won. But Chancellorsville had a cost that Lee could not replace. Stonewall Jackson, shot by his own men in the confused darkness after the flank attack, wounded in the arm amputated, pneumonia setting in, dead 8 days later. Lee wept when he heard, said he had lost his right arm, and he was not speaking metaphorically.
Jackson was the one subordinate commander who could take Lee's intentions and execute them without being told the details, could look at a situation and understand what Lee needed without needing it explained. The two men had functioned together as something close to a single military mind, and now half of that mind was gone. So Lee was going into the summer of 1863 with his most important subordinate dead, his army physically exhausted from 2 years of constant campaigning, his supply lines stretched thin, the Confederate economy struggling to feed and equip the men in the field. And in Richmond, Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet were looking at the map and seeing something that frightened them. Out west, in Mississippi, Ulysses Grant was slowly closing his grip around Vicksburg, the city that controlled the Mississippi River, the artery that connected the eastern and western halves of the Confederacy. If Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be cut in two, and Grant was going to take Vicksburg. Everyone who was paying attention could see it. The question was, what to do about it?
The obvious answer, the answer that several of Lee's fellow generals argued for, was to send reinforcements west, to take troops from Lee's army, which had been winning, and use them to relieve the pressure on Vicksburg. James Longstreet, Lee's most senior corps commander, made this argument explicitly and forcefully. Send troops west, save Vicksburg, keep the Confederacy whole. Lee said no, and what Lee proposed instead was the decision that led directly to Pickett's charge. Lee proposed to invade the North, to take his army across the Potomac into Pennsylvania, to threaten Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington itself, to force the Union to pull troops away from Grant to deal with the crisis in their own backyard, to win the war not by saving Vicksburg, but by making the North hurt so badly on its own soil that it would negotiate a peace. It was a brilliant idea. It was also wrong. And the reason it was wrong was not strategic. The strategy was defensible. The reason it was wrong was psychological. Lee wanted to invade the North because Lee was winning, and winning had changed something in him.
Had made him believe, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that the Army of Northern Virginia could do anything. Had made him forget, or push aside, or simply stop fully accounting for, the one thing that had always been true about his army. It was smaller than the Union Army, had always been smaller, had always won through speed and boldness and the psychological pressure that his presence put on Union commanders, not through strength, never through strength. His army was not built for the kind of battle that an invasion of the North might produce, a set-piece battle, a grinding engagement on ground he didn't choose, against an enemy fighting to defend its own territory. Jefferson Davis approved the plan. The Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac in June 1863, 150 miles into Pennsylvania, through the Cumberland Valley, through small Pennsylvania towns where the residents stood on their porches and watched Confederate soldiers march past with expressions of disbelief. The army moved well, moved fast, gathered supplies from the rich Pennsylvania farmland. And then on July 1st, 1863, the advance elements of Lee's army stumbled into Union cavalry outside a small town called Gettysburg, and the battle that Lee had not planned and had not chosen began almost by accident. The first day went well for the Confederates. They drove the Union forces back through the town and on to the high ground south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. The Union Army retreating onto ground that was, as any soldier looking at it could immediately see, extraordinarily strong defensive ground, high, with clear fields of fire in every direction, with the ability to shift troops quickly along interior lines, ground that a defending army could hold almost indefinitely against a force several times its size. Lee looked at that ground on the evening of July 1st, and here is the moment, here is the specific moment where the decision was made that led to everything else. Lee looked at the Union Army occupying the strongest defensive position it had held in 2 years of war and decided to attack it, not to go around it, not to maneuver, not to use the speed and psychological pressure that had always been his greatest weapons, to attack, frontally.
Against fortified high ground, the one thing his army had never been designed to do. Why? That is the question that has consumed historians for 160 years and will consume them for 160 more. Why did Lee, a man who better than anyone understood the mathematics of attack versus defense, choose to attack at Gettysburg? The answers are complicated and contested, and nobody agrees completely. But somewhere in the mill of all the analysis and the historiography, there is a simpler truth. Lee attacked at Gettysburg because he had been winning for 2 years, and winning had made him believe that his army could do what no army should be asked to do. He attacked because he was Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee attacked. Because the identity of the man and the identity of his army had become so fused with aggressive action that pulling back, maneuvering, refusing battle felt like a kind of defeat, even when it was the right decision. Because success had quietly, invisibly, dangerously narrowed the range of options that felt available to him. James Longstreet saw it.
Longstreet was Lee's most senior corps commander, the man Lee called his old warhorse, and Longstreet looked at the Union position on Cemetery Ridge on the evening of July 1st and said no, said it clearly and directly and repeatedly, said that attacking that position was a mistake, said that the army should move around the Union left flank, get between the Union Army and Washington, find good defensive ground and make the Union attack them, force Meade to come off those hills and fight Lee on ground Lee chose. Longstreet made this argument on the evening of July 1st, and again on the morning of July 2nd, and again on the morning of July 3rd. Lee overruled him every time. The second day's fighting on July 2nd was as savage as anything the war had produced. Longstreet's corps attacking the Union left flank, the fighting at Little Round Top and Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard and the Wheat Field. Thousands of men killed, in terrain so broken and rocky that it seemed designed specifically to make organized military movement impossible. The Union left flank bent, but did not break. The Union right flank, attacked by Richard Ewell's corps on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, held.
When the second day ended, the Union Army was still on its high ground, still intact, still looking down at Lee's army from positions that had, if anything, become stronger as Meade shifted troops and consolidated his line through the night. And on the morning of July 3rd, Lee made the decision that Longstreet spent the rest of his long life trying to explain and could never fully explain, because the honest explanation was simply that Lee was wrong, and the man he served would not listen. Lee decided that the Union's center had been weakened by the fighting on the flanks on July 2nd, decided that a massive assault directly at the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge would break through, split the Union Army in two, and win the battle. He gave the assault to George Pickett's fresh division, plus supporting units from other corps, 12,000 men total, across a mile of open ground, against artillery that the Union commanders had been positioning and repositioning for 2 days, specifically to cover exactly that ground. Longstreet was ordered to command the assault. He later wrote that he had never been so depressed in his life as on the morning of July 3rd. That he could not give the order with his voice, and instead nodded his head when Pickett asked if he should advance. That he turned away because he could not watch what he knew was about to happen. What happened is something that takes less time to describe than it took to occur. 12,000 men stepped out of the tree line on Seminary Ridge at approximately 3 in the afternoon on July 3, 1863. They dressed their lines. They fixed their flags. They began to walk. The Union artillery opened on them immediately, and the shells began to tear gaps in the Confederate formations that the men closed by stepping together and continuing to walk. They walked across the Emmitsburg Road. They walked through the fences lining the road, climbing over or tearing them down, reforming their lines on the other side. The Union infantry on Cemetery Ridge opened fire at effective range, and the casualties became catastrophic. Men were dying by the hundreds per minute. The formations that had stepped off from Seminary Ridge in perfect order were becoming ragged, and then fragmented, and then desperate. And still they walked, and then ran in the final yards.
A small number of men, perhaps 300 out of 12,000, actually reached the stone wall at the angle of Cemetery Ridge. They fought hand to hand for a few minutes. They were overwhelmed. They fell back. The ones who could still walk walked back across that mile of open ground toward the Confederate lines. Lee rode out to meet them, an old man on a gray horse, riding toward the broken remnants of 12,000 men who had done exactly what he asked them to do and paid exactly the price that anyone who looked at the ground could have told them they would pay. He said, "It is all my fault." He said it to Pickett, said it to the men coming back across the field, said it to anyone who would listen, and he meant it. In a war full of generals who found reasons and excuses and scapegoats, Robert E. Lee looked at what had happened and took the weight of it onto himself completely. George Pickett never forgave him. The division that bore Pickett's name had been destroyed. Every brigadier general in the division killed or wounded, 2/3 of the men casualties.
Pickett was a vain man and an imperfect general, but he had led his men across that field in person, and he had watched them die, and he knew whose decision had sent them there. When Lee later asked Pickett to rally his division for a possible Union counterattack, Pickett said he had no division. When the war ended, Pickett fled to Canada rather than face the possibility of prosecution, and when he eventually returned to Virginia,
He carried a hatred of Lee that he expressed privately for the rest of his life. He said Lee had his division massacred. He was not wrong. The Army of Northern Virginia retreated from Gettysburg on July 4, 1863. The same day, Vicksburg fell to Ulysses Grant, 1,500 miles to the west. Two Confederate disasters on the same day. The Confederacy cut in two in the west, the Army of Northern Virginia broken and retreating in the east. The summer of 1863 that was supposed to win the war had instead broken something in the Confederacy that would never fully heal. Not the Army. Armies can be rebuilt. The thing that broke was harder to replace.
It was the belief, the genuine, widespread belief in the South and in the North and in the European capitals that were watching, that Robert E. Lee and his army were invincible. That belief had been the Confederacy's greatest strategic asset, worth more than any number of rifles or artillery pieces, worth more than any single battle. And on July 3, 1863, on a mile of open Pennsylvania ground, it died with the men who walked across it. Lee lived with Gettysburg for the rest of his life, offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis after the battle. Davis refused it, continued to command the Army of Northern Virginia for nearly 2 more years, fought brilliantly in the Overland Campaign against Grant, held Petersburg for 9 months against an enemy with every conceivable advantage, did everything a general could do with a diminishing army and a dying cause. But Gettysburg was always there, the counterfactual that could not be escaped. What if he had listened to Longstreet? What if he had gone around the Union flank? What if the army that crossed the Potomac in June 1863 had come back to Virginia without the losses of those 3 days? Without the 6,000 men lost in Pickett's charge alone, without the irreplaceable officers killed on the slopes of Little Round Top and in the wheat field and at the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederacy lost the Civil War for many reasons: fewer men, fewer resources, fewer railroads, the industrial capacity of the North against the agricultural economy of the South, the blockade, the leadership of Lincoln, the generalship of Grant. All of these things are real, and all of them mattered. But somewhere in the middle of all those reasons is a July afternoon in Pennsylvania, a mile of open ground, 12,000 men stepping out of a tree line and walking toward guns, and a general who was too good at winning to know when to stop.